Welcome to this presentation. I studied organisational change for 3 decades and have been fascinated by the change tends to fail debate. So I'm going to make a little contribution in terms of this YouTube video, so enjoy. So I'll start by just acknowledging the interest and persistence of this assumption that change tends to fail. I'll then touch upon, for me, the roots of where the story begins back in corporate America in the 1990s. I'll then highlight my questioning of the 70% change failure rate, and then what happened next in terms of a journal special issue around change failure, and then draw some conclusions. So as I say, there's been this persistent assumption that organisational change tends to fail, and assumptions are of great interest to certain academics. And here we've got one of the famous papers. That's interesting. What a neat title for a journal paper, where Murray Davis was highlighting how sometimes our most important social science isn't backed by the best research. It's more that it says that it's quite interesting. So the underlying assumption is what carries it along. And this has been echoed in Alvin Gouldner's work and also in Alverson and Sandberg's work, particularly in a couple of fairly recent papers. So I'm following in good, very able footsteps, and I just want to say organisational change tends to fail. That's interesting. So for me, if you want to understand this story, you have to go back to 1990 corporate America. American businesses were really struggling. The Japanese were the equivalent of the Chinese today, in terms of particularly the car industry, and American businesses were struggling. And the critical spotlight turned to how change was being managed, and Michael Beer et al. Came out with this very influential paper, published in 1990, Why Change Programs Don't Produce Change. So an unequivocal assertion. There was some research in this paper. Many of the subsequent ones there wasn't any research, but they argued that the methodologies were flawed in essence. And I would say at the time it was a wake-up call to America in terms of how change was being managed. 95, another of the famous contributions in framing why change tends to fail, was published again in Harvard Business Review, Kotter's Leading Change, Why Transformation Efforts Fail. He came up with his 8 errors, and then in his 96th book he came up with 8 steps to lead change. So there you go. It was failing in 95 and succeeding in 96. I have a suspicion the key is the shift to leadership. But anyway, that again framed this interesting notion that change tends to fail. The big one, however, was another Harvard Business Review paper by Beer and Naraya, published in 2000. Excuse me. This was called Cracking the Code of Change, and it had that terrible line in it: the brutal fact is that 70% of all change initiatives fail. Brutal fact. These are quite loaded words, but anyway, that was the third impetus to this notion that change tends to fail. And the fact that they were quoting a statistic, the fact that it was Harvard professors, it seemed plausible. And ever since, I think most people have believed, change tends to fail, certainly, and more specifically, 70% of it fails. There was a bit more to this, though. As well as the paper in 2000, Beer and Naraya came out with a book, Breaking the Code of Change, where they gathered some of the leading academics to look at how they might break this code of change tending to fail. And the book was an output of that gathering, and it acted as a halo effect to the Harvard Business Review paper. I think many people believe that the evidence is within breaking the code of change. I've read the book and it isn't in there. They don't give us any unequivocal facts so that change tends to fail in 70% of instances. And equally, the Harvard Business Review paper had no theories, no evidence to back it up. So I hope I've given you a flavour of how we came to believe that change tends to fail. My moment was 2011. I came out with this rhetorical title: "Do 70% of all organisational change initiatives really fail?" Obviously, I was a decade younger then and a lot more naive, but it was an enjoyable journey, and it was a very useful paper in terms of how my career progressed. I won't go into the details, but to give you a flavour of what's in that paper, I shared with the readers that the failure rate wasn't supported by theory or research, so that's the first thing to say. I then went and looked more specifically at the 5 instances where it was cited. Hammer and Champy were talking about business process re-engineering, and they didn't explicitly say 70% of change fails. They offered a wide window of change failure, and in a book a year later they said they'd been misrepresented in anyone who believed 70% of change failed. The Beer and Naraya paper I've just mentioned, there's no evidence. It was just a rhetorical statement which was very interesting and took on the belief in many people's minds that it was social science, but it certainly wasn't. Carter in 2008 had a book called, I think, A Sense of Urgency, where he re-quoted that 70% of change fails, but when you looked closely at the quotation which the media picked up on, he wasn't actually offering any new evidence. And then business consultants Centuri et al. And Kellett at Aiken seemed to be finding some evidence that 70% of change initiatives fail, but when you drilled down, it wasn't the case. But read the paper if you want the details of that. Now, the important thing for this notion that change tends to fail is that we will never get to a change failure rate, or a change success rate. It's a really silly anti-academic generalization. This is because of the ambiguities of change. So many things can come under the label of organizational change, and it's likely they're more or less likely to fail or succeed. The context in which change is happening will be very important in terms of thinking about failure tendencies, failure percentages. Competing perceptions. I've known organisations where the senior management felt they'd wonderfully led change, but for many of the employees it wasn't so successful. The temporal aspects, we know that change is a process, and you can't really come at it with this notion change fails or succeeds. It's much more dynamic than that. And the measurability of organisational change, it's quite difficult to do a meaningful calculation to inform these mythical change tends to fail notions. So I thought with the 2011 paper that would be that, but in fairness, many academics in many business schools will still tell you change tends to fail, and in many organisations people will tell you change tends to fail. So my impact on the world wasn't as big as my ego would have liked it to be, and I completely accept that. I was so drawn to a call for papers in Human Relations, one of our most respected social science journals, in 2018, and what really caught my eye at the bottom there, the call for papers, a special issue on change failure, which I thought finally would nail this today. They were saying change tends to fail. So nothing had happened, nothing had moved on, despite my best efforts. I submitted to this call for papers, but the editor's desk rejected my paper, which was all about change not tending to fail. But that's fair enough. That's life. Moving on, the special issue came out in 2021 in Human Relations. So this is the whole of an issue of a respected journal devoted to organisational change failure. There are 5 papers in the special issue and the editorial by the editors, and anyone who's seriously interested in studying organisational change failure, I would encourage you to delve more deeply. This was probably the most significant contribution to our studies of organisational change failure. That's the good news. The bad news was on 4 instances in this editorial, I was cited as the reference that organisational change tends to fail. Irony of irony. I finally got a mention in Human Relations as the author who said organisational change tends to fail. Oh dear. I probably should have let it go at that. I was going to let it go, and then I thought, no, I've come to the end of my academic life, and I wouldn't have been to sleep easy knowing I'd been knowingly misrepresented. So in 2022, I came up with my response to the editorial with the title, How Studying Organisational Change Lost Its Way. I'm not going to get into that paper. I think for some it would be a contentious paper. I'm certain it would be, to be honest. But as I say, you have to be courageous in academia, and sometimes you have to say the awkward stuff, even if it's not what everyone wants to hear. But you know, organisational change tends to fail was going to go on unless somebody said, wait a minute, there's something not right here. So I have no qualms about that. So drawing some conclusions from this little presentation. Anybody who tries to tell you change tends to succeed or to fail, or gives you a generalised statistic, misunderstands organisational change. So it wasn't just I was being attributed as organisational change tends to fail's leading proponent. It was even the idea that there could be somebody who could support such nonsense. Why has it prevailed for decades? Professor Beer, in his contribution to the book Breaking the Code of Change, talked about an unconscious collusion between academics, consultants and managers, and I think there's something in this. I think change tends to fail because it helps business schools sell their courses, helps consultants sell their wares, and managers really like that acknowledgement that what they're doing is difficult and challenging. So we should give them a pay rise. Depictions of organisational changes tending to fail benefit academics, consultants and managers, as I say. One of the things I was working on in later life, and I won't unpack here, is if you went with the notion change tends to fail, why has there been so much interest and investment in leadership? There is billions spent on leadership development. Why, if it all fails? For me, it was managing change that was failing, and that was the driver for leading change. And the final conclusion, I'm referencing a highly respected journal in support of change tending to fail. So in some ways that is a result, isn't it? If nothing else, it's interesting. Okay, this has been a very short overview. There are many of the links to the papers I've talked about on my sexily named website, woodlanddecay.com. So lots of resources there, and if you want to get in touch, please do. There's a contact page, and I've sort of given up on academia, but I haven't quite given up on the debates. So on that uplifting note, I will continue my own decay. Bye for now.